Ubiquity means we're everywhere at once. Ubiquity, in this family we are one.
Interestingly enough, black people really took to the question of aviation. The Garvey movement was very deeply into aviation as a sign of modernity, as a sign, and also because they thought their enemies were going to use planes, as happened on a number of occasions, to basically shoot us from the air. Let's say beginning in Libya circa 1911, but continuing after that. And so in the 1930s, when Ethiopia, the independent African nation, was invaded by the Italians, we had black American pilots led by John Robinson of Chicago, who came to Addis Ababa, formed the Ethiopian Air Force, which led directly to the creation of Ethiopian Airways, which is still perhaps a leading carrier on the continent. And this was part of a larger story of black Americans using planes. And I should also mention the novel by the conservative writer George Schuyler, you may be familiar with. He did this novel called Black Empire. It's very interesting. I mean, it is interesting. Which has these scenes of these black Americans of Jim Crow taking to planes and then using machine guns against the racists in Mississippi. The story ends in 1957 with Sputnik, because part of the story is going to be story in conceptions of the heavens. And Sputnik, when the Russians and the Soviets send the satellite to outer space, dovetails with the Little Rock desegregation crisis. Recall when President Eisenhower had to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas. So racists were upset because courts had ordered desegregation. You had federal troopers sitting in the school cafeteria to keep black kids from being beat up. Well, many of, particularly Du Bois, other writers, made a big deal about this because they said the United States, one of the reasons they're being outstripped in outer space is because they don't want to educate their own people. I mean, look at it. People are rioting to keep black people from having education. How are you going to compete globally if you're not basically utilizing your human capital in a more effective and efficient manner? And so the confluence of Sputnik and the Little Rock crisis, I'm going to suggest, is one more aspect of this larger story of how external factors, now starting from space, help to influence the domestic scene here. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
We have time now. We got some time stretched out. By my count, there was about 22 of the books. So I left some. Although there was some he didn't mention that he referred to another Powell versus Alabama book.
Yeah.
The book on the Scottsboro Boys. So I mean, small book for audiences to understand. That having been said, let's take this opportunity. We got some time now. Please, questions, comments, folks.
Would you give your analysis of the work of Wilson Record, Harold Cruz, and other kind of anti-communist literature, and how you see it affect black scholarship today?
Well, since you're familiar with those names, maybe I should ask you that question. How do you see them?
I see it really as kind of, I think, negative in terms of perspective. I don't think it's even really that great of scholarship, especially Wilson Record and
Big Harold Cruz. Joe, for undergraduates maybe, so you might not know.
Okay. Well, Wilson Record, I think, was a sociologist based in Berkeley, California at one point. He wrote works on the NAACP and the Communist Party. And Harold Cruz, particularly, he was someone who was in the Communist Party, member, and eventually left. He wrote a very important book. I think raises good questions. I think very important questions. But I think they just want to get your down some of this kind of work is, I don't know if it's countered, but it's in addition to it, supplemented, and just overall is how it affects today, particularly our scholarship, or what you think is young scholars today.
Well, starting with Harold Cruz, who I had the opportunity to meet on more than one occasion. As you noted, he was a former member of the Communist Party and wrote this book, Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, among other books. And he's been criticized by the Jamaican scholar Winston James in his book Holding Up the Banner of Ethiopia for allegedly making derogatory comments about people of, quote, West Indian descent. Because one of the interesting things about, like Patterson, for example, his father was from St. Vincent in the Caribbean. So part of the argument is that, and actually some of the same thing was said about the Garvey movement, that you had these people from the Caribbean, according to this argument, come to the North American mainland, the United States, and they really don't understand the dynamics of the North American mainland. And they're too seized with the idea of their homeland, be it St. Vincent or Jamaica in Garvey's case. And supposedly, according to this argument, that's why what they're saying doesn't really work here in North America. And I have to say, I think Cruz is a bit one-sided, shall we say, with regard to his critique of West Indians. I think it's a bit over the top. With regard to Wilson's record, I think his scholarship, quote unquote, and I have to use inverted commas because he's not really, it's not that much primary research that he's doing, and it's permeated with the temper of the time. And as you well know, well maybe you don't know because you're all younger people, but at one time in the United States, to say that you were a socialist, and actually it's probably true still today, to say that you were a socialist was like saying, you're a follower of Satan, basically. I mean, you should expect persecution, you should expect perhaps indictment, perhaps even murder. And so his work is permeated with that sort of spirit, I'm afraid. And what's interesting is, just like I was talking about the United States of America, it really couldn't have come into existence without help from Paris and Madrid. And then you have the United States, and scholars like Record, they talk about movements here that they say have foreign ties, and that's supposed to be a mark against them. But the United States came into existence with foreign ties. They couldn't have triumphed. These ragtag rebels could not have triumphed against the leading superpower of the era, but for assistance from the antagonists, Madrid and Paris, of London. So I think that those are the sort of books that you'll find out on the mall tomorrow being sold for 50 cents, basically. Because I think it's sort of outlived its usefulness, if it ever had any.
I'm currently working on my dissertation about the Council on African Affairs. And I have a basic question for you. What would you say is the definition of black internationalism? And do you see it as different from Pan-Africanism or just a different branch from the same tree?
Yeah, I see it as interrelated. And just for those who may not be familiar, the Council of African Affairs was an organization that arose in the United States approximately 1937. It's led by Paul Wilson, eventually led by Du Bois after he's fired from the NAACP in 1948. That's something that is still worthy of discussion. And then it's forced into liquidation by 1956, along with many other organizations. I guess, with regard to black internationalism, I would say that what it amounts to, the recognition of what I just said, recognition by black people in the United States, that the correlation of forces, the balance of forces in North America very often tipped against us. And that therefore we have to lengthen the battlefield. That since polls, for example, well, you may recall that in Louisiana in 1991, David Duke, a leader of the Nazi Party, Ku Klux Klan, received 55% of the white vote for governor. So if the black folks had not turned out in massive numbers, who knows what might have happened. And I use that as an example of how the balance of forces is oftentimes tipped against us when you have overt and stated sympathies for Nazis and Klansmen, shockingly enough. And so the only way to survive in that kind of hostile atmosphere is to lengthen the battlefield and turn the tables, or in another way, be consistent with the spirit of 1776 and fight in foreign antagonists of those who are oppressing you to turn the tables against them. It was done historically, I would say, up until we cut this deal to erode Jim Crow approximately a half century ago that led to these compromises. perhaps the compromises were acceptable, but they were compromises nonetheless. And one of the compromises being sort of loosening, if not cutting our ties with the international community, which, to reiterate, not only puts us in a disadvantageous position, but also for supporters of Barack Obama, it seems to me that it puts him in a disadvantageous position to the point where, I've been making in some radio interviews recently, is that ironically and paradoxically, the most adamant and staunch supporters of President Obama should feel compelled to oppose some of his policies, particularly in the foreign policy realm, because those sorts of decisions are influenced not only by White House staff and advisors and by the Congress. The Syrian crisis is influenced by the Israeli lobby. It's influenced by the Saudi Arabians, who have a lot invested in this country and who have a particular point of view, shall we say. And I don't know if you've ever chaired a meeting, but if you've ever chaired a meeting, what you find is that oftentimes you're presiding over a body that's making decisions that you don't agree with, but as chairman, you're duty-bound to execute, put forward the best case for. And you either do that or you resign. So in many ways, Mr. Obama, his supporters in particular, is simply the chairman of the executive committee of the ruling elite of the United States. He's not the king. And when it comes to something like the Syrian crisis, in particular the Iranian crisis, there are many votes by the Israeli lobby, the Saudi lobby, etc. And that can even outweigh the Congress. Or it can lead to these this ironic anti-war sentiment of the Tea Party on Syria, where Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, a few months ago was calling for airstrikes against Syria, and then when Obama began to talk about it, he turned into a dove. Or the right-wing fringes of the Republican Party who said that Obama wanted to intervene in Syria because he wanted the U.S. Air Force to be the Air Force of Al-Qaeda so that they could massacre Christians, which carries out his Muslim agenda. So I say all this to say that support for a presidency does not always mean just supporting every policy. I mean, look at Libya, for example, which you may have recalled. Pentagon Chief Bob Gates opposed, but he was outweighed by Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, Susan Rice, then U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, now Ambassador to the UN. The policy has been a disaster. Production has fallen by 80% in Libya, which has led to the Saudis pumping more oil than they have in 32 years, which is putting enormous pressure on that regime, which supposedly helps keep oil prices stable. But the oil-producing regions of Saudi Arabia are in the Shia Muslim communities. There's a religious Cold War between predominantly Shia Iran, predominantly Sunni Saudi Arabia, and putting that kind of pressure on Saudi Arabia could ultimately be dangerous. But in any case, it's hard to say that the situation has improved in Libya since the bombing campaign of 2011. U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, was slain. Republicans making a big to-do about that. They plan to hang that around Hillary Clinton. The Benghazi killings, if she runs in 2016. So the Obama administration would have been better served if many of his most adamant supporters had actually opposed his policy with regard to Libya. Anyway.
As a scholar who's aspiring to be as prolific as you, what skills should we begin to hone as undergraduates, and how should we hone them?
Well, good question. Mundane skills, like being a fast typer, typist. More language study. Language study. What I tell graduate students is if you have any relatives in New York or Los Angeles, London, wherever, begin sending them postcards, cultivating relationships, because you might have to stay there to do research. Thinking of you, how's it going, how's the family? Being diplomatic. As I was telling Professor Carr, I think that a lot research and book writing is really ruthless synthesizing. That's why when I'm in the archive, I don't really take that many pictures, which is very popular nowadays, taking images. I'm always trying to synthesize as I'm doing research. I do research in language, like especially French, which I speak like a one-year-old. But if you're doing research in French, or research in English for that matter, which I speak, if you're going through all these pages, oftentimes I'm looking for words. So if I'm researching in French, this project on Hispaniola, I'm looking for keywords like, flag, looking for, word for slave, etc. And then once you see the keywords, then you focus, take out your little dictionary, and begin to try to understand what's going on. So it's not a matter of, like, if you're reading a book, presumably for a graduate class, presumably you're reading it carefully, you're reading every word. I mean, usually, in research, I'm just I'm skimming, looking for keywords that then you begin to focus on. I usually, obviously, work on more than one project at a time, because there's a lot of downtime with regard to scholarship. I mean, you're waiting for books from interlibrary loan, you're waiting to travel to an archive, and so when you have downtime on one project, you can turn to another project. Personally speaking, with regard to history, I see connections between the past and the present. So I try to study the present very carefully on a daily basis, which means reading the newspaper.
Which one you always have Financial Times.
Yeah, I read the, I mean, I have to say, see, the United States is so conservative that the Financial Times of London, the business paper of London, is really more progressive than The Nation, which is a supposed left-wing journal in the United States. That's because the United States is so far to the right. I mean, it's incredible. So I read the Financial Times. The Financial Times, I mean, obviously the economic factor is important, and so by reading the Financial Times, I think you get a better understanding of the foundational questions of economics, like the recent decision by the Federal Reserve here, not to reduce what the conservatives call printing money. The Financial Times coverage of that has been, I think, more sophisticated, more comprehensive, more insightful than, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times. And then, the U.S. newspaper, they're doing bad. Look at the Washington Post. Although, since the Washington Post did such a disservice to the black community of Washington, I'm not sure what. But, so on a daily basis, I read the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, LA Times, because I have this interest in popular culture. LA Times probably covers popular culture better than most of the newspapers. The Houston paper, because I live there, sort of. And then a lot of stuff on the web, allafrica.com, atimes.com, which covers Asian, Mail and Guardian of South Africa, the Herald of Zimbabwe, a lot of U.S. domestic papers, a lot of magazines, Essence, Black Enterprise, a lot of black newspapers, Final Call, LA Sentinel, New York Amsterdam News, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Ms.
Hello, Dr. Horne. My name is Crystal Gabriel, and my question is in regards to those trade-offs that you mentioned earlier that African Americans somewhat agreed to in an attempt to have a better position in American society. How do we position ourselves as far as being able to come together and talk about those trade-offs, whether they were worth it or not, when we have so many different perspectives as far as, and opinions as far as what was a good trade-off and what wasn't, so that hopefully when it comes time to making other trade-offs, we can be able to better negotiate?
That's a good question. Before I respond, how would you respond to your own question?
I would say at least at the beginning, definitely have healthy debate And I think that we would have to come together, those of us who are in the room, on some sort of common ground. Like we'd have to agree somewhere on something, anything. And, you know, begin that healthy debate and be able to accept different viewpoints of scholarship so that we can have all those opinions on some big board, essentially, and then begin to assess them one by one. And given, if we all have a good understanding of our history, our present, and at least some sort of insight into the future, that may be able to at least help us create better scholarship and know where we can have better, where we can come up with better research, or how we can have better research questions to continue the scholarship. But then as far as mobilizing to, again, if we are being brought to, if we do have opportunity to sit at the table again, and the U.S. government or something is like, okay, black people, this is what we were thinking we could do for y'all, blah, 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 what do you think? You know, I don't know.
One thing I suggest, actually, I've been thinking about this quite a bit recently. I think the NAACP, which in many ways is the largest membership organization in our community, should really apologize should apologize to W.B. Du Bois, his founder, for ousting him and ousting other people like him. Because I think it weakened the organization, and I think that that kind of debate that would erupt about that decision would be very healthy. It would cause us to go back and look at decisions were made and assess whether or not those were proper and correct decisions. It would do justice to Du Bois. I mean, we're asking for reparations for slavery, but this is a kind of reparations. We should not just limit it to slavery, although of course that's critically important. So that's one thing I think we need a discussion within the NAACP. Another thing I think that needs to happen, I think all of our organizations, including the NAACP, including the Congressional Black Caucus, which is meeting this weekend in Washington, as you know, should consider, they should be sending delegations. You can start with Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union. That's not that controversial. But, you know, delegations to Moscow, delegations to Beijing, delegations to South Africa, Brazil. The world is changing. The United States, basically the position of much of our leadership in the last few decades, it's been like married to the mob, basically. Which is, so we're telling the rulers of the United States, we don't care how you bring this goal here, just make sure we get our fair share, basically. And so you basically tend to take a dive on questions of imperialism, for example, and exploitation for the peoples, as long as we get our fair share. But the problem is the world is changing. With the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the joke is that when you mention the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, much of our leadership thinks you're making an abbreviation of a song by Lionel Richie and the Commodores a few decades ago about brick houses. They're so out of touch with how the world is changing. And with the U.S. share of global income shrinking, and of course the black community has had a precipitous drop in wealth since the crisis of 2008 on Wall Street. So the world is changing, and so we need to change with it. We need to, establish those now dissipated relationships that we used to once have. So those are the two primary suggestions I would make.
Let me start the debate tonight and first take you to task for saying that there was an agreement made because we weren't at the table to make that agreement. They just made a decision on their own. And maybe there were one or two so-called black people there who may have benefited, but we as a collective did not sit at the table and agree. And the other point I wanted to bring up was this whole concept of, well, we need to get together and debate it all out. I don't know if that's going to really work or happen, because it seems to me that since 1965, they changed the game a little bit, but kept the same rules in place so that they stay, and of course I'm talking about white people, that they stay in charge and in control of everything and give just enough to a few black people to keep the majority of black people passive and somewhat satisfied. So that most people, most black people, are afraid to stand up and say, I'm tired of hell of this shit. This is crazy. We should not be participating in this. So when you talk about white Americans, be it the Ku Klux Klan or other crazy groups, basically cutting down our black organizations, you know, when you think about, you know, what the former CIA director was doing to undermine all the different black organizations, or you talk about what, I just lost my train of thought on that one. But the bottom line, we need to stop being afraid, because right now they have fed us a diet of fear, so that most youth these days are afraid to a certain degree to stand up and just say, enough is enough. And my question to you is, as you so wonderfully pointed out all the wrongs that this country has done, what would be the likelihood of us unifying with black people, and actually some whites, around the world, and taking the United States to the world court, criminal court? Thank you.
As you know, the United States is not a signatory to the founding documents of the International Criminal Court. And in any case, as you probably know, the ICC seems to have this habit of only indicting African leaders. Which tends to suggest that the only leader of the North Atlantic community who might have a chance of being indicted is Obama. Certainly not George Bush or Tony Blair. But as you also know, William Patterson, and I talk about that in this book, he actually did that with Paul Robeson in 1951. Of course, he wound up being jailed for his gumption. That Malcolm X talked about the same thing. The National Conference of Black Lawyers, an organization I used to be affiliated with, tried to do the same thing. So it's obviously a live issue. And it's something that we should not let die. And we need to study the past examples. Even going back to the founding of the League of Nations after World War I, you may recall that William Monroe Trotter of Boston, one of the reasons he sailed across the Atlantic after World War I was to try to rally support against the United States with regard to lynching. You mentioned the CIA, and another tip to scholars is, young scholars, in the Freedom of Information Act, which I've been using for years now. This is, you file this request, I usually file mine with the FBI and CIA, to get documents, and it takes a long time. Matter of fact, if anybody wants to email me, I'll send you the kind of dummy letter that you use to request the documents. But once you're in the system, you don't have an FBI file, you'll have one after you file the On the other hand, the FBI, since they're spying on everybody, one of the reasons we know so much about Martin Luther King was because they were bugging his phone calls, and these hotel rooms, etc. Now those on transcripts. Of course, like any other evidence, you have to read it with a jaundiced and skeptical eye and make sure they're not feeding you something phony. But in any case, it can be very useful to a historian. I have boxes and boxes and boxes of documents that I've got. It's just like growing a zucchini. It just keeps coming. But it takes a while. So you should file immediately, if not sooner. And yes, well, with regard to being at the table, look, you had leaders of the NAACP who will go nameless, who collaborated with the FBI. So, you had leaders of organizations who were meeting with the U.S. president. To a degree, they were at, the saying in Washington is that you're either at the table or on the menu. Well, some of our leaders were at the table and we're still on the menu. We were on the menu.
My name is Chiamoru, and I'm curious about Black internationalism, and I want you to address a specific aspect of what I heard you present, and I definitely do my research to learn more. As you defined it, I'm more aligned with African internationalism, or familiar with it, in that specifically around the nation question. So I heard you just say that the concept of Black internationalism is to expand the battlefield to bring to wage greater leverage for other black people around the world to participate in the American process to assist black people here. Right? This is my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong. But so then I'm curious about where the true center of power of blackness is, if it really is here in America, or where everyone else is looking, and where everyone else has a plan, which is Africa, and whether it's AFRICOM or the old stories of the way they neo-colonizing it would have colonized it. We know the story. So, and we know the value of that land, and we know the value of the politics of that land. And I feel that our story centers around Africa. And so why would then Black internationalism seek to switch the location of where our power is truly activated, and what interest is that?
Well, my answer would be all of the above. I mean, I mentioned a couple of books I wrote on Kenya and Zimbabwe, where you actually had black people reaching across the Atlantic to help other black people. And of course, the anti-apartheid movement was an example of that. And I think underlying the anti-apartheid movement was the old Pan-African idea, which is that there was a linkage between the fates and destinies of people of African descent on both sides of the Atlantic, and that to the extent that we could help to liberate Africa, we're also helping ourselves. It's no accident, as I said, with regard to May 1963, that as the Organization of African Unity is being founded, that Jim Crow is beginning to crumble here. Or, for example, if you take my book on Los Angeles, the civil unrest, the book deals with 1965, but of course there's an addendum with regard to 1992. And what's striking about 1992, which I think is quite illustrative, is that after there was this perception that Korean merchants were being targeted, you had the Seoul government send delegations to meet with George H.W. Bush to put pressure on the United States. If you look at my book on Mexico, you'll find that you had Mexico City, the government, pressuring the United States with regard to persecution of people of Mexican descent on this side of the border. One of the problems that the Africans and the indigenous people, and I should also mention with regard to the lynchings of Italians in New Orleans in the 1890s, you had the government in Rome pressuring the United States with regard to that kind of persecution, which leads to its diminishing. One of the problems that the Africans in the mainland and the indigenous people have had is the lack of that sort of external pressure, which helps to undergird the notion of Pan-Africanism, which is helping to build this stronger Africa, which then supposedly can't intervene, as happened in May 1963, on behalf of black people in the United States. So it's a bilateral process, it's a multilateral process. I think, in terms of the center of gravity, I think that one of the things that's happened since April 1994 with the first democratic elections in South Africa, and I think this is a positive development myself, is that in many ways the flag of Pan-Africanism is, this first Pan-African Congress is taking place at the beginning of the 20th century. They were mostly heavily targeted against colonialism in Africa. But now, with the strengthening of the African Union, of course, with the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the strengthening of the African Union, the strengthening of South Africa, the liberation of South Africa, and the strengthening of Brazil, because I think oftentimes in the Pan-African discourse, somehow Brazil gets omitted, even though it has a larger black population than any place outside of Nigeria. So I think we're talking about a multilateral process, we're talking about a bilateral process. Here in North America, speaking to people presumably struggling here in North America, so I was trying to press that button strongly, but certainly it's a multilateral process.
Can I clarify that to get another angle of the response? Specifically around the nation question, citizenship, what interest is it of black people in America to identify as American versus as African, in terms of bidding for power, even as we reside here in North America. It changes the axis of our struggle if we now are participating in the American experiment as part of it versus as observers with our true objective interest, which is gaining our land back.
In doing this research on the late 18th century and the 19th century, one of the things that I find striking is is that, after the Africans who fought in greater numbers with London than they did with the rebels in 1776, and then many of them wound up moving to Syria and Leone. Then you had many Africans wind up moving to Liberia. Then, in terms of my present research, Hispaniola. You had thousands of Africans moving to Hispaniola, mainland Africans moving to Hispaniola, Haiti, in the 1820s. But then the United States was still a very strong country, and by the 1870s, the United States was, well, actually by the 1860s, you had Confederate slave ships sailing around the waters of Hispaniola. And people thought that they moved to Hispaniola to be free, and all of a sudden they were facing the prospect of being enslaved in Cuba, or even in Mobile. And the point is that, sure, we need to focus on all points, but I don't, for various reasons I carry my passport at all times. Kids have to get them. But also, I think as long as this is a powerful country, we need to try to have influence here. And because this country can chase us down. It's not as if you get outside the United States and you're home free. That's not how imperialism works. That hasn't been the experience of Sierra Leone, Liberia, Hispaniola, etc. They chase you down, they track you down. So you have to strangle this monster here. In addition to, in other words, we're doing double duty, we're doing triple duty. One of the reasons I'm doing all this research is because I recognize all of us have to work harder. We all have to heighten our productivity. Yes. Because many of us are in dire straits. So many of our community are in dire straits, and so we have to do triple duty.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Dr. Carr and Dr. Horne. I just want to thank you for your excellent presentation, particularly enlightening myself on some of the things I wasn't aware of in terms of the African Americans' efforts outside of the United States. You just started to really talk on some of the things that I was concerned about. I'm a Ph.D. student in African Studies. I just got back from Brazil, interested in Brazil and Africa. But what I was looking for, what I'm curious about, that you didn't really talk very much about, was the role of African Americans, particularly as they left America to form Liberia, which you briefly talked about, which was probably, might be considered one of the more successful efforts, but that's sort of questionable, given how they came and their role in Africa and how they treated some of the Africans. But I'm curious of how you would frame that particular effort in understanding the role of African Americans in the whole idea of internationalism in your talk today.
Thank you for the question. First of all, let me give a few notes to the younger scholars. We also need more research on Gabon, because the French did with Liberia, Gabon, what was done with Sierra Leone and Liberia. That is to say, Africans either caught on slave ships or moving from Martinique or other French colonies were sent to Liberia, and we need more research there. Likewise, Sylvanus Olympio, the first leader of independent Togo, who, Togo went through Togo, of course, is borders on Ghana, West Africa, went through many changes. German colonialism, French colonialism, its borders Ghana. So, Olympio, who was a descendant of repatriated Brazilians. We need more research. Actually, in my book, The Deepest South, there are a few notes on the Brazil. And of course, Brazil had more enslaved Africans than the United States by an order of magnitude. And you similarly had many of these Africans moving back to West Africa, including the family of Sylvanus Olympio, who, by the way, was assassinated, I think it was January 1963, right outside the gates of the U.S. Embassy, interestingly enough. That's somebody needs to look into that. U.S. Embassy in Togo. So we need more research on those kinds of repatriation. Even in the 1940s and the 1950s, and I think I talk about this in the book Cold War in the Hot Zone, which deals with Barbados, Jamaica, etc. You had attempts by the Africans there, assisted by the colonizing power, to go back to Africa. And we all know, of course, about Rastafarianism, the ties to Ethiopia, etc. And then I just mentioned Hispaniola, which I'm working on now, the fact that thousands of these mainland Africans moving to the northern coast of Hispaniola. And their descendants are still with us. Any baseball fans? Right. So you know about Torrey Hunter of the Detroit Tigers. He once made this comment about, he was coming on all the Latinos in baseball, and he says, well, you know, that's cool, but, you know, I want some of my people to. But what's interesting is that if you look at Dominican Republic, where a lot of these players come from, and you look at where these players have come from, many of them are coming from Samana, on the northern coast of Hispaniola. And many of them are actually descendants of the U.S. Negroes who moved there. So I guess you lose your card, your membership card, once you leave the United States. You are no longer considered to be a card-carrying Afro-American. Now, with regard to Liberia, as your comments tend to suggest, it's a very complicated case. As you probably know, it was not only free Negroes from the mainland trying to move there, it's also being expelled there. Particularly after Gabriel's revolt and the slave revolts that come 1800, 1802, right across the river in Virginia, largely inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And particularly after the Negroes helped to burn down Washington, D.C. in August of 1814, there's this impulse to get rid of the U.S. Negroes. I mean, somebody needs to do a book about that, all the different projects to, I mean, for example, in my Brazil book, I talk about how Lincoln, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, is negotiating with the Brazilians to send us all to Brazil, for example. Even before the Civil War, there was talk about that, sending us all to Brazil. And then, of course, Derek Bell, the late Derek Bell, the legal scholar, he wrote these fictional accounts about the U.S. leaders trying to send us into outer space. So Liberia is a complicated case because you have these U.S. Negroes going there, and in many ways, as exemplified by what happens in 1980 when you have the overthrow of the government, in some ways they set themselves up, the American Liberians, as something of a ruling elite, and they wind up paying a very severe and heavy price. That is to say, discriminating against the Africans who are already there. They named the city capital Monrovia after James Monroe of the United States. They have the flag, the U.S. flag. So it's a very complicated case, but there's no question that before the decolonization of Africa, Liberia and Black Americans had very close relations, particularly in the international sphere, with Liberia oftentimes being enticed to carry our flag into the United Nations, into the League of Nations, etc. And there needs to be more research about that. Speaking of the United Nations, they have archives too. In New York, they're very well organized. There's a lot of work that could be done about international efforts based on United Nations archive, just a train, an Amtrak train ride away, right in New York.
Good evening. I have a question about whether you have any thoughts or comments on the state of the city of Detroit. And also, I feel like not enough of us are paying attention to what's going on, and those of us that are in cities that are populated with a predominantly Black population may not realize that our cities could be next. Just wonder if you have any thoughts.
Before I speak, what would be your comment?
I feel like it's just being raided by the power elite.
Yeah, it's a very sad story what's happening to Detroit in terms of being forced into bankruptcy. That is to say that supposedly the city is not taking in enough revenue or enough money to pay obligations or to pay bondholders, people, cities, and colleges like Howard even. They raise money by selling pieces of paper, and then 10 years later, the people who loaned Howard that money, you get your money back plus interest. And so supposedly Detroit is being driven into bankruptcy because it has this revenue shortfall. Politically, I think Detroit is being punished. I analogize Detroit to Haiti. I mean, Haiti was punished for having the gumption of throwing out slavery, and it's been punished ever since to this very day. Detroit was once a militant citadel of resistance, of trade union activism, of Black radicalism, and all the rest. And from a certain point of view, that was setting a bad example. And it's also being punished by international forces. That is to say, bad decisions by auto executives. with regard to producing smaller cars for the longest period of time, and then they had to play catch-up ball with regard to Toyota and Nissan with regard to that, but that's very difficult. And then just global developments. I mean, inevitably, there's going to be auto production taking place in Brazil, which it is now. If you look at Brazil right now, it's a major producer of cars. Particularly, I mean, Fiat is basically a Brazilian company that we think is either Italian or US. Then, of course, the fact that the movement here has been weakened, the labor movement in particular, that's facilitating plants closing down here, moving to Mexico, for example, hampering Detroit. So Detroit has been the victim of politics, has been the victim of larger questions of political economy. And this is happening in a city that's about 80% black. And, you know, now, I mean, it's really painful to watch, I must say. Well, it looks like, yeah. Oh,
Get to the mic.
oh,
I'm really interested in trying to find out the source of my generation's pattern of self-loathing and ultimately complacency. And looking backwards, it seems as if the momentum that our community had has come to a sudden halt. So the closest that I've gotten to try to answer this question was the implementation of integration. So I was just wondering if you thought integration was, you know, our unknowing demise in, you know, where we are today.
I think that it was the way it was executed. As I said, I think too heavy a price was paid, particularly with the weakening or elimination of independent black institutions like the Associated Negro Press, which is occupying my mind now since I'm researching about it. And it's not only that, but the integration took place as working class trade unions were being weakened, as desegregation was unfolding. The problem with that is that most black people are working class people. And so we were giving concessions on the class front, as supposedly we were receiving concessions on the race front. But as the old saying goes, what that meant is that suddenly you had the right to sit at a lunch counter, but you didn't have the money to pay the bill. So part of it was how it went down, I think. And that's something that hopefully your generation will be engaging. And then with regard to this sort of weakening of unions and radicalism at the same time that integration was unfolding, I think this points to another paradox. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about, you know, all this gray hair I have is not dye. I got it honest. And so people of my generation, we probably had more opportunities to take advantage of, but many of us were trying to overthrow the system. And now, younger people today have fewer opportunities. They're trying to integrate into the system. It's very paradoxical, very, very ironic. And with regard to self-loathing, I mean, I think that was baked into the cake of the United States. Once you had a country that was founded not only on principles of white supremacy, but principles hostile to the abolition of slavery, then you had to construct a narrative, a historical narrative to justify that. So for the longest, the historical narrative was saying that, you know, the Negroes, they're like step and fetch it, you know. Why didn't they rebel more? Why were they so lazy? And so the whole question of loathing was baked into the cake, and then we had to do all this struggle to try to overturn that narrative. But like the beard that continues to grow on the face of the dead man, even after he's dying, even though we're in a new era, so to speak, and writers and scholars have done a fair job of overturning that narrative, the narrative that says that in order, because basically the US narrative was in order for the United States to make sense, you had to make it seem that black people had no sense. They tended to go hand in hand. So now we're overturning that, but there's still an aroma, more than an aroma, more than an after effect that still lingers.
A minute to thank Ubiquity for
inviting Gerald, but we also have older, but a great scholar in the audience, and I'd like to come and just say for a few words. You know, we're all in our 60s, but we have Dr. Robert Rose, the guy who sort of taught all of us here, and I don't think you students have had a chance to be exposed to him. Bob, you want to come up and say a few words? Dr. Bob Rose.
I didn't mind the NSA putting, or internet putting all my privacy on TV. I used Italian formula to put a little gray in my hair so I look distinguished. Just out of this rich Greeks, they need more money. But anyhow, I've been in relationship to Gerald Horne many times, and there's brilliant presentations in Afro-American history and politics. I'm in political science. I used to be, at least. I'm a retired professor. But it's going to be very controversial. Your most controversial thing would be on 1776, you know, because you're going against the major narrative in the United States. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with Donald Robinson's Slavery and the Structure, American Revolution, the black loyalists, etc., and the white loyalists, who were black loyalists even before Liberia went to Sierra Leone, and they had similar types of revolts. And that's a historic lesson on the question of the character of internationalism, including Pan-Africanism. I've taught courses on comparative analysis of pan-movements, and they have different tendencies. And the first Pan-African movement, if you recall, Paul Cuffey, all the Pan-Africanists in the 19th century started out in the civil rights movement and got frustrated somewhere. There's something including Stokely Carmichael before he became Kwame Ture. And they talked about it, Martin Delaney. They called it the metastasis of despair, when they realized, well, we're not going to make it. That's including Paul Cuffey, who started out in the movement, as you well know, was the same as the American colonists. No taxation without representation. And he had a little money, too. He was a thousandaire, which is a lot of money for the 19th century. But there's a danger in some forms of pan movements, which we need to look at closely, because it happened to the Pan-Arab movement, it happened to the Pan-American movement, which was anticipated in the 19th century by Mr. Simon Bolivar, who was in I would say, in the Pan-American movement. He said something very poignant. He said, the United States, at that time we were not called America. They started with the Manifest Destiny movement around the Mexican-American War. The United States will project America into a massive poverty in the name of liberty. And that might seem like something obsolete since it's back in the 19th century, but there's a Bolivarian ALBA movement, the Bolivarian alternative in Latin America, which is a direct riposte to the theory of empire for liberty that comes from Thomas Jefferson. But I'm going to stop at this point. But this is a complicated question that needs further elaboration. The best way to get further elaboration is listen to my favorite Horace Silver record. It's called Bip Boop Biddy But anyhow, you guys know how to rap. When we were young, we all knew how to bebop. It's much harder. You have to remember the changes. You have to remember the changes in political life.
All right, I would like to bring Osceola aboard just to kind of close us out, and then we have a couple of announcements afterwards, and also some of Dr. Gerald Horne's books are outside for sale. I'm pretty sure he'll be more than willing to sign any.
How much are they? $20.
There we go. $20. All right, so Osceola.
Integrated Society. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today. Dr. Horne brought up some extremely crucial points that we should look to as young people who are seeking to be scholars and activists and just African people in general. One is that we cannot acquiesce to this idea of American exceptionalism, because in doing so, we're compromising a historical narrative as well as a cultural narrative and political power. The cultural narrative in that when we remove ourselves or decontextualize ourselves from this internationalist context, we invalidate the diffusion of culture that has occurred. I mean, either from the Kanakas that ended up in California or communicating with the Japanese. And in doing so also, we truncate our political power. Because when we limit ourselves to the United States, obviously we're in dire straits. But with contemporary issues like the prison industrial complex and the daily impoverishment we experience on a daily basis, we need to leverage that power, again, as Dr. Horne has pointed to, by beginning to reach out. We have Brazilian students from Brazil on campus today. It's not like a monumental thing to reach out. We have foreign exchange students that we can communicate with and begin to build bridges with. And we need to take advantage of those opportunities. We have Spanish, Swahili, even Medu Neture. We can learn these languages, we can do it. It's not an infinitesimal thing. We just need to break it down into steps. So I'd like to thank Dr. Horne, Dr. Carr, Ubiquity, and Numa, and KTS for making this event happen, because it's really changing my life. Thank you.
UBIQUITY means we're everywhere at once. UBIQUITY, in this family we are one. Let me talk to the